So we've talked before about valence electrons and how valence electrons are important in determining the chemical reactivity of different kinds of atoms. So just as a reminder, atoms that have an incomplete valence shell, say for instance, if this is an electron, one electron in the first shell, this atom isn't stable and it wants to do whatever it can to be able to stabilize its energy, right? So there are basically three different ways that an atom might try to create a full valence level. One, it could try to add electrons. Two, it could try to give away electrons. And three, it just might decide that it's going to share electrons. And this sharing strategy is what we're going to talk about today. So when an atom interacts with another atom, it is forming what's called a chemical bond. This interaction, this chemical bond, links the two atoms together in something that's called a molecule. Now, we're going to be talking about covalent bonds, and this means that the atoms are going to share electrons. And covalent bonds are very strong bonds. They're very important in biology because they're very stable, and because most biological molecules are made up of covalent bonds, these biological molecules then are very stable. So atoms with more than one valence electron, so let's take carbon for instance. Carbon has 4 valence electrons. So it has the opportunity to form 4 different covalent bonds. So I can have it bond with hydrogen, say, and hydrogen will provide 1 electron of its own. And now these two types of atoms, the hydrogen now is sharing electrons, so it has essentially 2 valence electrons, and the carbon atom, instead of having 4, now has 8 valence electrons. So both the carbon and the hydrogen have stabilized their valence level by sharing electrons. Now, instead of these dot representations of the electrons, the bond between the atoms is often abbreviated with a line. So I can draw the 4 bonds that carbon can form with these hydrogens like this. Now, because carbon has 4 valence electrons, it can actually form up to 4 different bonds. And it's possible to form multiple bonds with the same partner atom if that atom also has enough valence electrons for that to happen. So an example of a double bond would be if I had 2 oxygen atoms. Those 2 oxygen atoms can share 4 electrons between the 2 atoms, forming an oxygen molecule. So this is the oxygen that we breathe in the air and which keeps us alive. By the same token, I could have another kind of bond. I could have a triple bond. And that's 3 sets of electrons, or 6 electrons being shared between 2 atoms. Nitrogen gas that's found in the atmosphere is a molecule in which 2 nitrogen atoms are triple bonded together. So one final thing that's sort of nice about covalent bonds in particular is that you can make some predictions about how the molecule will look. The bond length is predictable, so the distance between these 2 atoms is always going to be the same as long as it's these 2 atoms. The angle at which the bond occurs is always the same. So if we take a water molecule, for instance, that is actually H2O, and the angle that we find between these 2 bonds is always going to be the same. We've learned a little bit about chemical bonding today, and also specifically about covalent bonds. We've learned that atoms are most stable when they have a full valence level. And so atoms that don't have a full valence level are always trying to achieve that state, either by adding, subtracting, or sharing electrons. And when these strategies are employed, the atoms become linked by a chemical bond. And these atoms that are linked by a chemical bond form what's called a molecule. And we've talked a little bit about one of the ways in which atoms can bond together, and that's by a covalent bond in which the electrons are shared between the two atoms. Covalent bonds are very strong and very stable, and we'll find out later how that's important in biology.